She was born into a title, married before she could read, buried, forgotten, and rediscovered 5 centuries later beneath the stones of Westminster Abbey. Anne de Mowbray never ruled, never spoke in council, and never reached adulthood, but her brief life reshaped the inheritance laws of England. This is not a story of triumph or rebellion. It is a record of how power passed through a child, how marriage could be signed before speech, how a young girl's name secured land, titles, and legacy then vanished into archival silence. A noble birth in a tumultuous age. Anne de Mowbray was born on 10 December 1472, during one of the most politically unstable periods in English history. Her birth took place at Framlingham Castle in Suffolk, a property held by her father, John de Mowbray, 4th Duke of Norfolk. The Mowbrays were among the most powerful noble families in late medieval England, tracing their lineage through generations of military service, royal favor, and strategic alliances. The title of Duke of Norfolk carried significant prestige, and the family controlled extensive estates across East Anglia. Anne's mother, Elizabeth Talbot, was the daughter of John Talbot, 1st Earl of Shrewsbury, connecting Anne through maternal lineage to another established noble house, with deep ties to the English crown. The timing of Anne's birth coincided with the final decade of the Wars of the Roses, a protracted conflict between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. These civil wars had destabilized the realm for over 30 years, altering the monarchy multiple times and eroding any sense of long-term political stability. In 1471, just a year before Anne's birth, Edward IV of York had defeated Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Soon after, Henry VI was killed in the Tower of London. Edward's return to power marked a period of relative calm, but the court remained wary. Nobles who had once supported the Lancastrian claim were stripped of titles or exiled, and those who remained loyal to York were always mindful that fortunes could reverse without notice. Anne was the only surviving child of her parents. This fact alone had immediate political implications. Her birth secured the continuation of the Mowbray line, but also made her a key figure in dynastic strategy. As a female heir to one of England's greatest dukedoms, she stood to inherit vast lands and income. Under the peerage system, she could not wield military authority, but her eventual husband would gain significant control through her titles. This made her not only valuable, but vulnerable. The crown could not allow such resources to pass outside of royal control through an unsupervised marriage. On the 17th of January 1476, when Anne was just 3 years old, her father died unexpectedly. With no brothers and no surviving male relatives of close proximity, Anne became the sole heir to the Mowbray fortune. This sudden concentration of wealth and titles in the hands of a small child prompted swift intervention by the monarchy. At the time, Edward IV was strengthening Yorkist authority through strategic marriages. The orphan Duchess's inheritance was no longer viewed as a family matter, it had become a matter of state. In March 1476, Parliament passed an act allowing the Crown to take control of Anne's lands and determine her marriage. This was not unusual. Royal guardianship of heirs, particularly female ones, was common and legally sanctioned, but in Anne's case, the speed and focus of the king's actions reflected her rare position as a peeress in her own right. The wardship secured not only her person, but also her wealth. The king now controlled her daily upbringing, education, household, and eventual alliance. Anne's upbringing shifted under royal supervision. Her family's influence diminished after her father's death. The Talbots, though well-connected, did not push back against the royal claim. At the time, resistance to the king's authority would have carried risks, especially in the wake of civil war. Edward IV had shown he would act decisively against noble houses that challenged him, and there was no appetite for conflict over a child's guardianship. From her earliest years, Anne de Mowbray became a subject of state planning rather than private life. Her identity as heiress to the Mowbray line placed her under constant scrutiny. Her future marriage would not be a matter of family preference or personal affection, but a tool for political consolidation. The crown had already begun identifying suitable matches before she could speak in full sentences. In the court of Edward IV, royal daughters and noble heiresses were instrumental in maintaining alliances. Anne's place in this machinery was sealed before she could form memory of it. Her noble birth gave her significance. It also made her a target of royal strategy. Heiress at 3. The weight of the Mowbray legacy. When Anne de Mowbray's father, John de Mowbray, 4th Duke of Norfolk, died on the 17th of January 1476, she was just 3 years old. In that moment, Anne inherited not only his ducal title but vast estates across East Anglia. She became Duchess of Norfolk in her own right, a rare status in 15th century England, where titles typically passed through male heirs. The Mowbray lineage was among the most distinguished in the realm, tracing back to the Norman conquest and tied to powerful families like the Bigods and Fitzalans. Her inheritance represented not only wealth but the consolidation of centuries of influence. The Mowbray estates included properties in Norfolk, Suffolk, and surrounding counties. Among them were Framlingham Castle and Bungay Castle structures, both symbolically significant and strategically located. These lands generated income, offered military potential, and granted regional authority. Such assets in the hands of a child, especially a girl, posed risks in a period when royal control over the nobility was a constant concern. Parliament and the Crown were particularly wary of child heiresses, whose future marriages could shift power. Edward IV acted quickly. Within weeks of the Duke's death, Anne was placed under royal wardship. A legal order passed on the 12th February 1476 granted the king authority over her estates and marriage prospects. This move, framed as protective, also served a calculated political goal: to draw the Mowbray legacy under Yorkist control. A female heir with no brothers presented a unique opportunity for royal consolidation. Her future husband would control her lands, and the king would decide who that husband would be. In early 1477, discussions began to arrange a marriage between Anne and Prince Richard of York, Edward IV's second son, born in August 1473. Richard was just a few months younger than Anne. The proposed union would unite the Mowbray estates with the royal family, neutralizing any independent influence the duchy might wield. The marriage served not just familial interest but national strategy. This followed a wider pattern of the period. Heiresses were often used to reward loyalty, strengthen alliances, or prevent rivalries. In Anne's case, her wealth was extensive. Her inheritance included hundreds of manors, military strongholds, and legal jurisdictions. The proposed match was not a ceremonial affair. It represented a fundamental shift in the ownership of regional power. While these arrangements were conducted in royal courts and councils, Anne herself was likely raised in a carefully supervised noble household. She would have been educated alongside other noble children, particularly daughters of high-ranking families. Such households emphasized obedience, modesty, and religious training. For Anne, being a duchess meant additional scrutiny. Her routines, companions, and speech were monitored closely. There are no surviving letters or personal accounts from Anne's early life. Most of what is known comes from royal records and legal transactions. These documents show a life managed entirely by others. Revenues from her estates were collected by crown-appointed officials. Her person was transferred between noble guardians aligned with the king. Every decision regarding her property, movement, and education came from above. The consequences extended beyond Anne herself. Other members of the extended Mowbray family saw their hopes of inheritance or influence vanish. Political allies of the Mowbrays were sidelined. The royal guardianship of Anne served as a signal to the broader nobility that the crown would intervene directly when powerful families lost their male line. It showed that wealth tied to women would be absorbed into royal hands. By age 4, Anne's future had been fully mapped out. Her marriage was already being arranged. Her holdings were already in the possession of royal agents. Her signature titles, Duchess of Norfolk, Countess of Norfolk, Baroness Segrave, existed only as ceremonial references to a past the crown had now appropriated. In the space of a year, Anne de Mowbray had shifted from child of a powerful family to a silent tool of dynastic strategy. Her legacy was no longer personal, it became a political resource. The Mowbray name, once linked to baronial independence and noble resistance, was now part of the Yorkist crown. For Anne, the role of heiress brought no power of her own. It was a burden carried in silence, decided before she had even learned to speak for herself. A crown's solution, the marriage decree. By early 1477, Anne de Mowbray had been under royal wardship for over a year. Her estates, guardianship, and future were fully absorbed into Edward IV's administrative control. What remained was the matter of her marriage. With such immense inheritance and ducal status, Anne could not be allowed to marry outside royal influence. The crown treated her less as a private individual and more as a political asset. The proposed solution was to bind her permanently to the House of York. On the 15th of January 1478, Parliament passed an act authorizing the marriage of Anne de Mowbray to Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York and second son of Edward IV. Both children were under the age of 5. Anne was 5, and Richard was 4. The marriage had been planned in advance and was designed to secure Anne's lands under Yorkist control. A critical clause in the act allowed Richard to retain her entire inheritance even if she died without issue. This provision overrode traditional inheritance laws. Normally, if a noblewoman died childless, her estate reverted to her closest kin. In Anne's case, that might have meant distant Mowbray relatives reclaiming the lands. To prevent this, Edward IV's legislation ensured that Anne's holdings would remain within the royal family, regardless of outcome. This raised quiet concern among the nobility, but no one openly challenged the move. Edward's authority was strong, and few were willing to oppose a legal maneuver so central to royal interests. The marriage ceremony took place at St. Stephen's Chapel in Westminster Palace. Despite the young ages of the bride and groom, the event was conducted with full ceremonial formality. Anne wore a velvet gown, and Richard appeared in miniature court dress. The king and queen were present, along with senior nobles and clergy. Though symbolic, the ceremony had binding legal consequences. It transferred control of Anne's estates and future to the House of York. She became both Duchess of Norfolk and Duchess of York, with her daily life now managed under royal authority. After the marriage, Anne likely continued living in a separate household, under the care of appointed ladies of the court. She would have received instruction in religion, behavior, and the expectations of noble womanhood. As a royal bride, her education and movements were carefully structured. Her identity and purpose were now fully aligned with the monarchy's needs. Child marriage was not unusual in 15th-century England, especially among nobility. It was a tool to secure alliances, manage succession, and redirect wealth. Anne's case stood out due to the size of her inheritance and the speed of the marriage's implementation. No one expected a shared life between the children for several years, but the legal framework was already complete. The future of the Mowbray estates had been decided by law and ceremony. There is no record of Anne's personal reaction to the marriage. No letters or testimonies in her own words survive, but financial records show that income from her estates was managed on behalf of the young Duke of York. Revenues were directed through royal agents, and guardianship was handled by individuals trusted by the crown. Anne's legal autonomy was removed in practice and policy. The political logic was straightforward. By marrying Anne to Prince Richard and securing permanent control of her inheritance, Edward IV eliminated a potential threat and absorbed a powerful estate into the royal fold. The act prevented any rival claimant from using Anne's marriage as a political foothold. Her personal rights were secondary to the crown's goal of stability and consolidation. In the broader context of Yorkist rule, this marriage was part of a larger pattern of royal centralization. Strategic unions, adjusted inheritance laws, and wardships were tools used to control the aristocracy. Anne's marriage was not merely personal, it was a state decision. Her estate became a Yorkist asset, her title a means to secure regional influence. What followed the marriage was a period of quiet administration. Anne remained under supervision, her properties managed by others. Her role had been assigned, her value accounted for, and her path controlled entirely by the crown. Ceremony of Innocence. The child wedding. The child marriage between Anne de Mowbray and Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, took place on 15th of January, 1478. Both were under the age of 6. The ceremony was held in St. Stephen's Chapel within Westminster Palace, a space often used for royal occasions, and its location emphasized the gravity of the union. Though the bride was only 5 and the groom 4, the event was far from private. It was attended by King Edward IV and Queen Elizabeth Woodville, as well as high-ranking nobles, church officials, and members of the royal household. The details were intended not to reflect childhood, but to represent power, order, and dynastic consolidation. The children were dressed in fine garments. According to wardrobe accounts, Anne wore a gown of velvet, trimmed in ermine, with gold thread woven through the seams. Richard's outfit matched the splendor expected of a royal prince's mall robes tailored to mirror the king's court attire. Both children were presented before the Archbishop of Canterbury, who officiated the symbolic ceremony. Though the union was not to be consummated, the rites were binding under both canon and parliamentary law. A platform had been constructed inside the chapel to ensure all guests could witness the vows. Chroniclers described Anne as small, pale, and solemn, while Richard stood beside her in practiced formality. Their hands were joined by the Archbishop, and a Latin blessing was spoken. The entire ritual was carefully choreographed, down to the moments when attendants were to step forward with ceremonial objects. The ring, sized for a child's finger, had been commissioned in advance. Its insertion marked the legal sealing of the marriage. This was not a private family arrangement. The ceremony was the final step in a long administrative process designed by Edward IV. The royal treasury had funded preparations, and Parliament had preemptively passed a bill ensuring that Richard would inherit Anne's vast estates, even if the couple remained childless. The wedding was not for love or companionship, it was to secure the Mowbray inheritance inside the Yorkist line. Court musicians played throughout the event. A procession of lords and ladies carried banners representing both families, the Mowbray Lion and the Yorkist White Rose. After the marriage, a feast was held at Westminster Hall. As was custom, the children did not participate fully in the celebration. They were led away to their respective quarters, under the supervision of their nurses and ladies-in-waiting. The feast, however, was grand in scale and cost, serving as a statement of royal wealth and control during a time when England had only recently emerged from civil strife. Contemporary observers commented on the strangeness of such a young couple being given adult responsibilities, even in symbolic form. But this practice was not without precedent. Throughout medieval Europe, marriages between noble children were used to cement alliances, especially when the inheritance of land or titles was at stake. What made this case unique was the extent of state involvement. The English crown had directly restructured legal inheritance for this marriage, altering customary law to prevent Anne's estates from ever reverting to her extended family. After the wedding, Anne was officially styled as Duchess of York. However, she did not live with her husband. Custom dictated that the couple remain apart until reaching an appropriate age, often around 12 or 14. Anne continued to reside in a separate royal household, likely under the care of the Countess of Rivers or another high-ranking noblewoman associated with Queen Elizabeth. Richard remained with his siblings and tutors, part of the structured upbringing designed for Yorkist princes. No letters or personal writings survive from Anne during this time. Like many royal children, her voice is missing from the historical record. What remains is documentation of her role, defined almost entirely by political and legal necessity. She was a wife in the eyes of the church and crown, though still a child. The public saw little of her, but chronicles and heraldic accounts preserve the event as a calculated act of Yorkist consolidation. For Edward IV, the marriage achieved what military action might not. Anne's personal story faded, subsumed into a larger structure of dynastic control and royal strategy. A bride without power. The royal nursery years. Following her ceremonial wedding to Richard of Shrewsbury in January 1478, Anne de Mowbray entered a phase of life shaped not by companionship but by routine and control. Both she and Richard were still under the age of 6. Though recognized as husband and wife in the eyes of church and crown, they did not live together. Instead, Anne was placed in a royal nursery household known of several institutions designed to raise and monitor noble children under court-appointed supervision. These nurseries were typically located in secure residences such as Eltham Palace, Sheen, or Greenwich. They offered both physical protection and political insulation. For Anne, they also represented a removal from her mother's influence. As a royal ward, she became the legal responsibility of the crown. Her daily care, education, and surroundings were directed by individuals with no familial ties to her, but strong allegiance to the Yorkist regime. Anne's early upbringing followed the norms expected of noble girls. Her household likely included a governess, several attendants, a priest, and tutors. Education focused on obedience, piety, and the accomplishments deemed appropriate for a young noble woman: sewing, music, reading of devotional texts, and court etiquette. Children in such environments adhered to strict schedules. Mornings began with prayer, followed by structured lessons and supervised play. The goal was not only moral development, but the cultivation of discipline and loyalty. As both Duchess of Norfolk and Duchess of York, Anne held rare dual status. Her garments reflected this. Royal accounts document purchases of velvet, damask, and finely embroidered materials bearing the arms of both her natal and marital houses. Even at this young age, her clothing served as political expression. The display of heraldic emblems on a child's dress reinforced her value to the state not as an individual, but as a bearer of dynastic claims. The marriage, while legally binding, did not require shared living arrangements. There is no evidence that Anne and Richard had meaningful interactions beyond ceremonial appearances. Each continued to live within their own royal nursery, separated by custom and practical considerations. The concept of marital partnership was irrelevant at this stage. What mattered was that the union had taken place, securing the Mowbray inheritance for Yorkist control. Administration of Anne's estates continued under Crown oversight. Revenues from her vast holdings were collected by officials acting on behalf of her young husband. Though Anne's name appeared in legal documents, she had no direct authority. Her identity as an heiress had been absorbed into the broader machinery of Yorkist policy. She became a silent link in a network of royal finance and territorial consolidation. No letters or writings from Anne survive from this period. Like many child brides of the nobility, her voice is entirely absent from the historical record. This silence is not unusual. Noble girls were frequently mentioned only in the context of their marriages, dowries, or deaths. Their personalities, emotions, or development were rarely recorded unless they intersected with political or dynastic concerns. Anne's mother, Elizabeth Talbot, disappears from central records after the marriage. It remains unclear whether she maintained any contact with her daughter. As a widowed noblewoman, she may have retained ceremonial privileges at court, but legal authority over Anne had ended. Under the laws of wardship, the crown controlled Anne's placement, upbringing, and future. Her maternal connection, though biologically intact, held no official power. The nursery years were also years of stasis. Anne's future had already been determined. The titles she carried, the lands attached to her name, and the marriage she had entered were all decisions made by others. She was a participant in national strategy before she could form lasting memories of her own life. Even her time at play or rest was likely watched, recorded, and shaped to align with the court's expectations. By age 6, Anne had become more symbol than child, named a duchess, a wife, and an heiress, yet allowed no real choice. Her days followed rigid schedules set by others, far removed from maternal warmth or family life. Every detail of her environment served royal interests, not personal comfort. In the royal nursery, Anne's identity was shaped by politics, not affectionate childhood governed not by freedom but by quiet orchestration. Widow at 8, Anne's sudden death. Anne de Mowbray died unexpectedly in November 1481, at just 8 years old. No clear cause of death was recorded in surviving documents. Unlike other high-profile deaths of the period, there was no detailed chronicle of illness or extended public mourning. Her passing was acknowledged in court records, but the specifics remain absent. The silence has left historians uncertain whether her death was due to sudden illness, accident, or conditions common in childhood at the time. At the time of her death, Anne had been married for nearly 4 years to Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, the second son of Edward IV. The marriage, though legal and sanctioned by both Parliament and the Church, had never evolved into a shared domestic life. Anne and Richard lived in separate royal households, and their union remained symbolic an arrangement for consolidating lands and titles rather than a personal relationship. Anne was buried in Westminster Abbey, a sign of her status despite her young age. Edward IV arranged her interment in the chapel of St. Erasmus, a small space often associated with royal children. Though her funeral was not extravagant, it followed appropriate ceremonial norms for a child of noble and royal affiliation. Her coffin was small, and the monument marking her grave was modest, reflecting both her age and her transitional identity between noble and royal status. Her death triggered not only quiet mourning, but a renewed legal debate. Under typical inheritance law, a noblewoman who died childless would see her estates revert to her family's nearest male heir. In Anne's case, that would have meant the vast Mowbray holdings returning to extended relatives within the Mowbray or Talbot lines. However, the Marriage Act passed in 1478, arranged by Edward IV to secure Anne's marriage, included a special clause. Even if Anne died without children, her husband would retain her estates. This provision did not go unchallenged. Several distant Mowbray family members objected, arguing the act bypassed established rules of succession. They claimed Edward IV's legislation had unlawfully diverted Anne's inheritance. The Crown upheld the clause. It had the full backing of Parliament and the Church, and no higher authority could overturn it. As a result, Richard of York retained control of the Mowbray estates, and the independent Mowbray legacy was absorbed into the Yorkist estate. Anne's life had ended, but her name remained active in legal records, property rolls, and dynastic arrangements. Her personal story was eclipsed by the political use of her titles and lands. Even in death, Anne was treated less as an individual and more as a vessel of noble power. The impact of her death was not a memory or tribute, but a demonstration of how royal policy could override traditional inheritance. Soon after her burial, the chapel of St. Erasmus was dismantled to make way for Henry VII's New Lady Chapel. During this transition, Anne's coffin was quietly moved, though no detailed record of the relocation survives. For centuries, her final resting place was unknown. Her tomb faded from royal history, and references to her life disappeared from public memory. She became one of many forgotten children whose fates were tied to the ambitions of the crown. Then, in December 1964, her remains were uncovered by construction workers near the chapter house of Westminster Abbey. A small lead coffin was found, bearing an inscription identifying it as Anne de Mowbray. The coffin had been sealed and preserved remarkably well. The discovery sparked renewed interest in her story and brought attention to the overlooked significance of her short life. A forensic examination confirmed her identity using burial records and the coffin's position. Anne was reinterred in Westminster Abbey, this time with a modern plaque acknowledging her historical role. While still modest, the reburial gave a degree of dignity to a figure once known only through documents and lineage charts. Her legacy, though not based on personal decisions, reflected the ways in which royal authority could reshape noble history. Anne left no known writings, portraits, or personal records. Yet her death marked the legal end of the Mowbray line as an independent ducal house. Her story concluded quietly, but its consequences echoed through the legal and political structures of the time. The question of her inheritance. The death of Anne de Mowbray in 1481 reopened a complex legal issue, who now rightfully controlled the immense Mowbray inheritance. Her marriage to Richard of Shrewsbury, though unconsummated and symbolic, had included provisions that defied standard feudal practice. Typically, when a noblewoman died without children, her estates would revert to her extended family's male line. But Anne's case had been altered by royal intervention. In January 1478, a special Act of Parliament arranged for Anne's marriage to Richard. Alongside the ceremonial elements, it included a highly unusual clause. If Anne died without heirs, her property and titles would not revert to her natal family. Instead, they would remain in the hands of Richard, and by extension, the House of York. This clause ensured that even in the absence of a child, the vast Mowbray lands would serve the political interests of the crown. The Mowbray estates were not minor holdings. They spanned Norfolk, Suffolk, and several other counties. The family had accumulated wealth and influence over generations. The Dukes of Norfolk had been one of England's most powerful noble houses, and Anne, as the last of the line, had brought that entire legacy under Yorkist control through her child marriage. Her death, however, triggered concern among other branches of the Mowbray and Talbot families. Distant male relatives believed they had a legitimate claim under hereditary law. Their objection was rooted not only in custom but in fear that the crown was setting a precedent to bypass noble succession. If royal authority could rewrite inheritance law to favor dynastic control, then centuries of landed rights could be overridden. The challenge to the Marriage Act reached both legal and ecclesiastical circles. Legal scholars debated whether an Act of Parliament could permanently displace ancient inheritance customs. The Church, while generally supportive of royal marriages, was less certain about laws that altered bloodline entitlements. The opposition argued that Anne's property should have passed to her closest male relatives within the Mowbray line, regardless of her marriage. Despite these arguments, the Crown held firm. Edward IV's legislation had passed with parliamentary support and was confirmed by ecclesiastical approval at the time of the wedding. The courts ruled that Anne's inheritance would remain with Richard, now about 11 years old. For Edward IV, the decision was not just about land, it was about ensuring that Yorkist control over England remained stable and unchallenged by rival noble houses. This outcome ended any independent continuity of the Mowbray legacy. The Mowbray name no longer carried autonomous political weight. Its wealth was absorbed into the Yorkist estate, administered on behalf of Richard. In practice, the estate was managed by royal agents, with revenues flowing into Yorkist coffers. The redistribution of power through Anne's death was completed with little resistance once the courts ruled in favor of the act. The implications were significant. It demonstrated the increasing ability of the late medieval English monarchy to manipulate feudal systems. Nobility had long relied on legal customs to protect their legacies, but Anne's case revealed how quickly those customs could be modified. Parliament, under royal direction, had shown it could transform an heiress into a mechanism of political consolidation. The legal records surrounding the dispute are technical but clear. They detail property grants, revenue accounts, and confirmations of title transfer. But absent from these documents is any acknowledgement of Anne herself as a person. Her voice, like that of many noble girls, was not included. She existed primarily as an asset valued not for her choices, but for her name, lineage, and holdings. In the years after Anne's death, her inheritance remained a tool of Yorkist strategy. Richard, still a child, held titles and estates through her, elevating his status and strengthening York control across eastern England. The Mowbray lands, once independent, now served the Crown's interests. These legal maneuvers, while effective, later drew criticism as Edward IV's death destabilized the realm. By 1483, Richard disappeared presumed dead in the Tower, leaving the fate of Anne's estates uncertain again. Her inheritance had shown how royal authority could override tradition, transforming childhood marriages into instruments of dynastic power and reshaping succession by legislative design. Richard of York and the Princes in the Tower. Following the death of Anne de Mowbray in 1481, Richard of Shrewsbury, her young husband, remained at the center of Yorkist dynastic planning. At just 8 years old, he held titles not only as Duke of York, but also, through Anne, as Duke of Norfolk and Earl of Warenne. These distinctions were symbolic of consolidated political power, yet Richard himself had little understanding of the authority they implied. His position would soon be tested by the rapid unraveling of the Yorkist state after his father's death. In April 1483, Edward IV died unexpectedly. His heir, Edward V, was only 12 years old. Richard of York at the time was around 9. Both boys were initially under the care of their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, and the Woodville family, who had risen in prominence through Edward IV's marriage. However, their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III, moved quickly to assert control. He intercepted Edward V's entourage as the young king journeyed toward London and placed him under protective custody. Soon after, Richard of York was removed from sanctuary at Westminster Abbey and joined his brother in the Tower of London. At the time, it was common for monarchs to reside in the Tower prior to coronation. However, the delay of Edward V's coronation raised concerns. By June 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, declared the children illegitimate based on an alleged pre-contract of marriage involving Edward IV. Parliament passed the Act Titulus Regius, legitimizing Richard III's claim to the throne. The two princes, Edward and Richard, remained in the Tower but were seen less frequently in public as the summer progressed. After mid-1483, no confirmed sightings of the boys exist in the historical record. Their disappearance marked the beginning of one of England's most enduring historical mysteries. Chroniclers and observers noted the absence, but official explanations were never provided. Foreign ambassadors recorded rumors of foul play, but no formal investigation was undertaken. For Richard of York, the marriage to Anne de Mowbray had once positioned him as a linchpin in the Yorkist consolidation of land and legacy. Now, that legacy was eclipsed by political suspicion. Various theories about their fate emerged within decades. Some claimed the boys had been murdered on Richard III's orders to eliminate rival claims. Others suggested they died of illness or were quietly hidden away. In later years, pretenders emerged, including Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard of York, having escaped the Tower. These claims were never substantiated. The lack of physical evidence only deepened the uncertainty. One possible clue came centuries later. In 1674, during renovations at the White Tower, workers discovered a box beneath a stairwell containing 2 small skeletons. Charles II ordered the remains interred at Westminster Abbey, assuming they were the lost princes. However, no definitive forensic analysis has confirmed their identity. The remains were exhumed briefly in the 1930s, but the inquiry was limited in scope and did not yield conclusive results. Richard of York's life, like Anne de Mowbray's, was brief and politically charged. He left behind no letters, portraits, or personal accounts. His name persisted largely through records tied to title and land. After his presumed death, the estates once absorbed through Anne's inheritance passed through various royal hands as regimes changed. The Mowbray legacy, initially preserved to strengthen Yorkist power, was eventually scattered. The disappearance of the princes served as a pivotal turning point in English dynastic history. Richard III's legitimacy was questioned from the outset, and the uncertain fate of his nephews undermined public confidence. In 1485, his reign ended at the Battle of Bosworth Field, where Henry Tudor defeated him and took the throne as Henry VII. One of Henry's first actions was to destroy Titulus Regius, restoring the princes' legitimacy, though the mystery of their fate remained unresolved. Richard of York and Anne de Mowbray, Bound by a marriage arranged for power, both vanished before adolescence. Their titles outlived them, serving political aims they never understood. By century's end, their names faded from memory, remembered only through contested estates and lingering uncertainty. What remained was not their presence, but the unresolved silence woven into Yorkist collapse. A coffin lost for centuries. After Anne de Mowbray's burial in 1481, records of her physical resting place quickly became unclear. She had been interred at Westminster Abbey, specifically in the chapel of St. Erasmus, space used for royal children and persons of noble status. The funeral was arranged by Edward IV and followed standard ceremony, though not elaborate. Despite holding the titles of Duchess of York and Duchess of Norfolk, Anne's age meant her funeral lacked the prominence of adult royal burials. The chapel of St. Erasmus did not survive into the next century. In 1502, Henry VII began construction of the Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey, intended as a grand burial site for the Tudor dynasty. The demolition of existing chapels, including St. Erasmus, followed. Anne's remains, buried within the demolished structure, were quietly relocated elsewhere within the abbey. No detailed record of this reburial survives. If any existed, it did not pass into modern archival collections. The absence of documentation regarding Anne's coffin was not unusual for major building projects of the time. Though the abbey generally maintained burial records, individuals of lower political relevancy, especially children, were sometimes omitted during architectural transitions. Over the years, Anne's brief life and marriage became known only through legal documents and heraldic registers. Her original tomb disappeared from institutional memory. By the 17th century, even the location of the original chapel of St. Erasmus was difficult to define. Alterations to the abbey's interior, along with war damage and administrative changes, further obscured the site. Anne's burial became a historical footnote, overshadowed by broader narratives such as the fall of the House of York and the rise of Tudor power. Her name faded from public remembrance. In December 1964, her story resurfaced. During maintenance work near the chapter house of Westminster Abbey, workers unearthed a small, sealed lead coffin. It bore an identifying inscription indicating it contained the remains of Anne de Mowbray. The coffin had rested undisturbed for nearly 500 years beneath layers of structural debris. The discovery drew immediate scholarly interest. Archaeologists and historians confirmed the identification using the inscription and cross-referencing older burial references. While no surviving document described her reinterment, the location near the chapter house was consistent with known relocation patterns during the Tudor renovations. Anne's coffin was opened under controlled forensic conditions. Inside were the skeletal remains of a young child, with no evidence of trauma. The preservation of the coffin allowed examination of dental and skeletal development, which aligned with Anne's recorded age at death height years old. No intact grave goods were found, though small fragments of textile material were noted. In 1965, Anne's remains were reburied in Westminster Abbey with a new plaque to identify her. The reinterment was simple without the formal spectacle of royal funerals, but it provided long overdue recognition of her place in England's dynastic history. The reburial also gave her a fixed location in the modern abbey, restoring some of the dignity lost during centuries of obscurity. Anne's rediscovery prompted renewed reflection on forgotten figures in medieval politics, particularly child nobles, who were used in alliances and legal arrangements but left little personal trace. Her life had been shaped by the crown, and her body had vanished from historical view until construction brought it back into the record. The case also highlighted the fragility of burial traditions and documentation, especially during periods of architectural change. Anne's story became a lens through which scholars reconsidered the ways history preserves or loses those who lived at its edges. Her coffin did not change political narratives, but it restored one missing piece to the puzzle of Yorkist history. Anne de Mowbray never ruled, never made speeches, and never exercised personal power. But her rediscovery offered a final chapter to a life once dictated by titles and dynasties. Her reburial marked the quiet return of a child who had once touched the politics of the throne and vanished, quite literally, into the stones beneath it. The unexpected discovery in Stepney. In the winter of 1964, routine construction work was underway in Stepney, in London's East End. The project involved the clearing of ground near the chapter house of Westminster Abbey, a location not commonly associated with royal burials. Workers were tasked with excavating debris and preparing the area for maintenance infrastructure. As they dug through the compacted layers of soil, one of their tools struck something solid, unexpectedly metallic, and distinctly shaped. What emerged was a small, lead-lined coffin. It was rectangular, tightly sealed, and noticeably smaller than an adult burial container. Within hours, representatives from Westminster Abbey and the London Museum arrived to assess the find. Upon inspection, they confirmed the coffin was of significant age and bore an inscription that would alter the historical understanding of one long-forgotten figure. The lead casing was inscribed with a Latin text identifying the remains as those of Anne de Mowbray, Duchess of York. The discovery came as a surprise. Though records confirmed her initial burial at Westminster Abbey in 1481, historians had assumed her remains were lost during the 16th century renovations led by Henry VII. The location in Stepney was not far from the abbey, but was not marked as a recognized burial site. Experts surmised that the coffin had been moved quietly during the demolition of the chapel of St. Erasmus to make way for the Lady Chapel. The coffin's placement near the chapter house likely reflected a decision to keep Anne's body within abbey grounds without dedicating a new tomb or plaque. It was a practical move during a period when political priorities outweighed individual commemoration. The lead coffin was taken under the supervision of archaeologists and transported to a secure facility for examination. Forensic experts from the British Museum and medical consultants specializing in osteology were brought in to study the contents. When the coffin was carefully opened under controlled conditions, the remains inside confirmed what the inscription had suggested: a child's skeleton, consistent with the estimated age of Anne de Mowbray at the time of her death. There were no preserved textiles or jewelry in recognizable form, though trace elements of woven material were detected on the bones. The analysis showed no evidence of physical trauma or congenital disease. Dental development aligned with that of an 8-year-old, and the skeletal proportions matched period expectations for a child of high status. Despite the centuries of burial, the coffin's construction had shielded the remains from total degradation. This unexpected discovery renewed scholarly interest in Anne's life and the broader implications of child marriages, dynastic consolidation, and forgotten burials among the English nobility. Though she had died centuries earlier, the circumstances of her life had always intersected with major political structures. Her reappearance invited new conversations about how history preserves power and forgets individuals. The media response was limited, but respectful. Newspapers in December 1964 reported on the find, often referring to Anne as a lost duchess. The tone of coverage avoided romantic speculation, instead emphasizing the importance of the historical correction. For the Abbey, the discovery presented both a logistical and ethical responsibility. To ensure the remains were handled with dignity and properly reintegrated into the site's burial record. In 1965, Anne de Mowbray was reinterred at Westminster Abbey with a formal plaque. The reburial, though not a state event, was conducted with ecclesiastical ceremony and attended by historians, clergy, and officials from the abbey. The new inscription clearly marked her identity, linking her to her brief political role in the late 15th century and restoring visibility to a figure previously absorbed into anonymity. The discovery also shed light on the broader challenges of historical memory within monumental architecture. The reorganization of burial sites, particularly during the Tudor period, often meant the displacement of earlier tombs. Children, especially those without direct heirs or extended influence, were at risk of being moved without record. Anne's case became a symbol of those silent transitions, unrecorded movements that altered the map of royal memory. Her coffin, long hidden beneath routine construction, resurfaced as quiet evidence of how easily individuals slip from history not by malice, but by shifting priorities. Anne de Mowbray's reappearance reopened questions about power, inheritance, and forgotten lives shaped by royal decree. The reburial at Westminster Abbey. The reburial of Anne de Mowbray in 1965 marked the quiet resolution of a 5-century absence. After her small lead coffin was discovered near the chapter house of Westminster Abbey in December 1964, preparations began to ensure that her remains would be returned to consecrated ground within the abbey. Unlike the original burial in 1481, which was arranged by Edward IV during the height of Yorkist rule, this second interment occurred under vastly different circumstances, without royal decree or political significance, but with modern respect for historical continuity. Anne's coffin had been examined by forensic experts shortly after its discovery. The remains inside were consistent with a child of about 8 years of age, matching Anne's known age at death. The coffin's inscription provided her name and year of death, confirming her identity beyond doubt. Once analysis was complete, the Abbey began coordinating with church officials and historians for a reburial that would acknowledge her historical role while reflecting the modesty appropriate for a figure largely forgotten by the public. The ceremony took place within Westminster Abbey in 1965, not far from where her coffin had been found, though she had once been buried in the chapel of St. Buried. Erasmus, that chapel no longer existed, having been demolished in the early 1500s to make room for Henry VII's Lady Chapel. No record had survived to indicate the exact location of her relocated coffin during the Tudor renovations. Her reburial thus became not just an act of restitution, but a practical necessity ensuring her remains would no longer be misplaced or disconnected from the Abbey's memorial tradition. The service was private, attended by a small number of clergy, Abbey staff, and historians. There were no royal attendees, no processions, and no state announcements. Yet the atmosphere was formal, conducted with the gravity appropriate for someone who had once carried the titles of Duchess of Norfolk and Duchess of York. Her coffin, still sealed, was lowered into a new grave and marked with a plaque bearing her name, dates, and titles. The reburial returned Anne to the public record. For centuries, her story had existed primarily in legal documents, acts of Parliament, property disputes, and genealogical charts. Her physical presence, once lost beneath layers of construction and institutional change, was now re-established within the very institution that had once buried her. The Abbey's historians updated visitor materials and memorial guides to include a note about Anne de Mowbray, situating her alongside the many other figures interred within its chapels and cloisters. This renewed visibility did not alter Anne's historical role, but it offered scholars and the public a concrete reference point. Her life had always been more symbolic than personal, shaped by dynastic plans and legal maneuvering. She had not left behind letters, portraits, or recorded words. Yet the rediscovery and reburial of her body brought renewed attention to the individuals, especially women and children, whose stories were often excluded from mainstream narratives but were central to the mechanics of royal power. The event also drew limited press coverage, mostly from British newspapers reporting on the historical curiosity of a lost princess rediscovered beneath Westminster. Articles emphasized the unusual nature of the find: a royal child's coffin unearthed by accident, identified through inscriptions, and returned to sacred ground. Public reactions were subdued yet respectful. There was no spectacle, only a quiet acknowledgement of a past that had slipped through the cracks of time. In the years following her reburial, Anne's story became a small but stable part of historical discussions surrounding child marriage, inheritance law, and the legal use of marriage alliances in the 15th century. Her case continued to serve as an example of how the lives of noble children were structured more by law and politics than by personal development. The 1965 reburial, while brief and ceremonial, served as a modern acknowledgement of that reality. Anne de Mowbray, who had once been positioned to unite two great houses, had no descendants, no written legacy, and no personal impact on the politics of her day. Yet her body, discovered and reburied centuries later, provided an enduring symbol of how the smallest figures in dynastic planning could leave the most lasting impressions through silence, absence, and eventual rediscovery. Child marriage in the medieval world. Child marriage in medieval Europe was not uncommon, especially among the nobility. These unions were rarely about companionship or domestic life. They were legal mechanisms designed to control land, lineage, and power. The marriage of Anne de Mowbray to Richard of Shrewsbury in 1478 was an example of this practice at its most strategic. Both children were under the age of 10. Their wedding, conducted with the sanction of Parliament and the Church, was less about personal union than about consolidating the estates of two powerful families. In the 15th century, marriage age was shaped more by economic and dynastic calculation than by emotional maturity. Canon law set the minimum age for valid marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Betrothals could occur earlier and were sometimes followed by immediate marriage ceremonies, though cohabitation was often delayed until both parties reached puberty. Among aristocratic families, the earlier the marriage could be formalized, the sooner estates could be settled, alliances secured, and rival claims preempted. Child marriages were common tools used by monarchs and noble houses to secure borders, pacify rivals, or absorb wealth. Daughters were particularly valuable in this context because they could be paired with younger sons of the crown or ambitious heirs of rival families. Marriage was a political act first, a personal one only later if at all. Anne de Mowbray's situation illustrates how early marriage could be used to alter the course of inheritance law. As the sole heiress of the Mowbray fortune, her union with Richard of York allowed Edward IV to redirect those lands away from competing noble families. By formalizing the marriage before Anne was old enough to speak for herself, her inheritance was locked into royal control. The marriage contract included clauses that bypassed the usual rules about inheritance reverting to the natal family in the absence of offspring. While such marriages were legal, they sparked debate even within contemporary circles. Some church officials expressed unease about unions between children, especially when consummation occurred before physical maturity. Papal dispensations were sometimes sought for child marriages involving close kin or unusually young partners. However, the moral reservations rarely outweighed the legal and political utility. The Church blessed most noble marriages, regardless of the age of the couple, so long as the political motives did not contradict ecclesiastical law. Among the lower classes, marriage typically occurred later. Peasant girls often married in their late teens or early 20s, while boys married when they had the means to support a household. In contrast, elite families viewed early marriage as a protective measure against contested inheritance or unwanted alliances. A young heiress left unmarried was vulnerable to abduction, coercion, or rival courtship. Arranged marriage at a young age secured her destiny under the terms favorable to her family or, in Anne's case, to the king. The psychological and emotional consequences of child marriage in the medieval world remain difficult to document. Very few personal writings survive from children who experienced these unions. In most cases, the voices of young brides are silent in the record. Chroniclers focused on titles, land transfers, and ceremonial pageantry, not on the experiences of the children involved. What is known must be inferred from legal codes, family correspondence, and the decisions made on behalf of child spouses by their guardians. The Church's position on consummation was nuanced. While marriage could be contracted in childhood, consummation was expected to wait until both partners were physically mature. In practice, this guideline was not always followed. Historical records note instances of premature consummation, especially in politically urgent marriages. However, the lack of personal testimony from those affected makes the true scale of these experiences difficult to gauge. Anne de Mowbray's marriage to Richard of York never progressed to cohabitation or physical union. She lived in a separate household until her death at age 8. Yet her case shows how a legal marriage, even in name only, could realign property, titles, and influence. In medieval Europe, child marriage was not an anomaly, but a structured element of noble life sanctioned by law, supported by the Church, and wielded as a tool of dynastic strategy. Anne's childhood was shaped less by family and more by formal agreements that prioritized inheritance over personal agency. Heiress as commodity. Controlling female wealth. In late medieval England, female wealth was not viewed as autonomous. It was something to be claimed, redirected, or secured through marriage. Noble heiresses, especially those without brothers, were treated less as individuals and more as conduits for the transmission of property and power. The case of Anne de Mowbray exemplifies this structure in full operation. From her earliest years, Anne's considerable inheritance was not managed for her benefit, but for the benefit of those who could attach themselves to her claims. Anne's inheritance came through a long-established line of nobility. The Mowbray family, holders of the Dukedom of Norfolk, possessed estates in several key regions including East Anglia and Yorkshire. Upon the death of her father, John de Mowbray, 4th Duke of Norfolk, in 1476, Anne became sole heir to a sprawling network of manors, titles, and legal privileges. She was just 3 years old. Under the normal conditions of inheritance, this would have presented a temporary problem to be resolved by guardianship until Anne reached adulthood. However, her wealth made her a political asset too valuable to wait. Instead, Edward IV swiftly arranged her betrothal to his second son, Richard of Shrewsbury. The match was codified in a 1478 Act of Parliament that ensured Anne's property would not revert to her family line but remain with her husband, regardless of whether the marriage produced children. This act bypassed long-standing customs of reversion and collateral inheritance. It effectively transformed Anne from an heiress into a vessel for the consolidation of royal control. Through her, vast noble estates passed into the House of York without bloodshed or prolonged dispute. The legal framework surrounding the marriage underscores how noble girls could become instruments of political economy rather than participants in it. The status of women as heiresses placed them in a vulnerable position. While law acknowledged their right to inherit, it did not guarantee their control over what they inherited. Upon marriage, a woman's holdings became subject to her husband's authority. Even widows, unless specifically granted protections, often found their estates managed by male relatives or overseers appointed by the crown. The idea of a woman managing large estates independently was treated with caution and often as a temporary situation. This legal landscape reinforced the use of strategic marriage as a mechanism for redirecting wealth. In Anne's case, her age and orphan status left her particularly exposed. She had no siblings to defend her claim, no maternal family strong enough to intervene, and no ability to influence the terms of her own life. The result was a legal and marital arrangement that served state interests, wrapped in the language of guardianship and duty. Documents from the period describe Anne's marriage, not in emotional terms, but in legal and financial ones. Records focus on the transfer of titles, the preservation of claims, and the conditions set by Parliament. Her personhood is almost entirely absent. She is represented only through seals, signatures, and heraldic symbols attached to broader agreements. The phenomenon of using heiresses as economic tools was not unique to Anne. Similar arrangements can be found across Europe during the period. In France, for instance, noble daughters were routinely pledged in early childhood to cement alliances. In the Holy Roman Empire, the heiress of a minor principality might be married off to guarantee peace between rival lords. These marriages rarely centered on the consent or comfort of the girls involved. The bride's role was to bring property, not perspective. What distinguished Anne's situation was the extraordinary speed and legal precision with which her inheritance was secured by the crown. Her case bypassed even the limited safeguards typically afforded to noble women, setting a precedent for how royal authority could rewrite established custom. Through a single act of Parliament, inheritance law was reshaped into an instrument of centralized control. Even after Anne's death in 1481, the terms held firm. Richard of York retained her estates, unchallenged by familial claims. Anne's story illustrates a broader medieval pattern. Heiresses treated not as individuals, but as mechanisms of transfer. Their identities mattered less than what they could convey: land, legitimacy, and influence repackaged through legal decree. What distinguished Anne's situation was the extraordinary speed and legal precision with which her inheritance was secured by the crown. Her case bypassed even the limited safeguards typically afforded to noblewomen, setting a precedent for how royal authority could rewrite established custom. Through a single act of Parliament, inheritance law was reshaped into an instrument of centralized control. Even after Anne's death in 1481, the terms held firm. Richard of York retained her estates, unchallenged by familial claims. Anne's story illustrates a broader medieval pattern. Heiresses treated not as individuals, but as mechanisms of transfer. Their identities mattered less than what they could convey: land, legitimacy, and influence repackaged through legal decree. What distinguished Anne's situation was the extraordinary speed and legal precision with which her inheritance was secured by the crown. Her case bypassed even the limited safeguards typically afforded to noblewomen, setting a precedent for how royal authority could rewrite established custom. Through a single act of Parliament, inheritance law was reshaped into an instrument of centralized control. Even after Anne's death in 1481, the terms held firm. Richard of York retained her estates, unchallenged by familial claims. Anne's story illustrates a broader medieval pattern. Heiresses treated not as individuals, but as mechanisms of transfer. Their identities mattered less than what they could convey: land, legitimacy, and influence repackaged through legal decree. The female body in dynastic politics. In 15th century England, the bodies of noblewomen were not simply personae, were tools of political design. This was especially true for child heiresses like Anne de Mowbray. Her physical existence, not her will, became central to questions of inheritance and dynastic alignment. Monarchs, nobles, and Parliament viewed her not as a child, but as a conduit for consolidating power. The value of a female body in aristocratic politics was tied directly to reproduction. Marriages were arranged not only for property, but for the production of heirs. Even when consummation was years away, as in Anne's case, the assumption of future fertility justified the union. Anne was legally bound to Richard of York not for companionship, but for what she represented: a fusion of bloodlines and estates. Though unusually young, Anne's experience was not exceptional in form. Noble girls were commonly married or betrothed before puberty. Church law allowed marriage from age 7, with consummation expected later. These early arrangements framed the child's body as a future resource or legal status, as wife, granting immediate control of her inheritance, regardless of physical maturity. Anne's marriage was solidified by the 1478 Act of Parliament, which granted Richard of York permanent rights to her estate, even if the marriage remained unconsummated. The clause severed the traditional requirement that a union be physically completed before inheritance could pass. In legal terms, Anne's body had already fulfilled its purpose, serving as the legal mechanism through which wealth and status were transferred. This treatment reflected broader cultural expectations. Noblewomen were expected to marry for family advantage. Their personal readiness or preference carried little weight. Marriages were formal contracts, often arranged by monarchs or senior family members. A girl might be coached to give consent, but it was rarely a decision made freely. A noblewoman's worth was measured in what she could transmit: title, land, and legitimacy. When she was an heiress, as Anne was, her body became a direct channel through which royal or noble power could be expanded. Her personhood was secondary to the role she played in law and lineage. Control of the female body extended far beyond marriage. Daily life for girls like Anne was tightly regulated, Her diet, wardrobe, education, and movements were arranged by court officials. She was presented publicly when it suited royal optics, and kept from view when it did not. While her surroundings were refined, her agency was minimal. She lived more as an emblem than an individual. Contemporary portraiture reflected this same ideology. When noble girls were depicted, their images emphasized family symbols, chastity, and noble identity rather than personality. Though no confirmed portrait of Anne survives, any commission likely would have depicted her not as a child, but as a titled figure serious, composed, and symbolic. Medical theories of the time further justified the control of noble women. Female bodies were considered more unstable, more emotional, and less rational than male counterparts. This belief underpinned their exclusion from politics and reinforced their designation as vessels for dynastic continuity. Anne, like many girls of her rank, was seen not as autonomous, but as an object to be arranged. Even after death, Anne's body remained subject to political processes. Her original burial site, the Chapel of St. Erasmus, was later demolished during Tudor renovations. Her remains were quietly relocated, her resting place unmarked and forgotten for centuries. Her body, once a centerpiece of dynastic planning, was set aside as royal focus shifted elsewhere. This pattern was not unique to Anne. Across Europe, noble girls were married into alliances, often without ever living long enough to reach adulthood. Their identities were shaped externally, their value tied to what others could gain through them. They were heirs, tokens, vessels, and solutions to political puzzles. Anne de Mowbray's life, though brief, reveals how the female body functioned as a tool of royal strategy in medieval England. She was born into nobility, but her future was written in legal language long before she could speak for herself. Remembering Anne, a silent duchess in history. Anne de Mowbray was never meant to be forgotten, yet history allowed her to slip from view. Born into one of the most powerful noble families in England, she became a duchess, a royal bride, and an heiress by the age of 5. She was married by decree, buried by royal order, and later exhumed by accident. Yet throughout these events, her voice never emerged. No letters survive, no recorded words. Her presence in the archives is limited to legal documents, marriage contracts, and one unearthed coffin. Anne's memory did not vanish because she lacked status. She was, after all, married to Richard of York, the younger son of King Edward IV. Her wealth was significant, her family name ancient. What vanished was the personal narrative. Her life was absorbed into the machinery of politics so thoroughly that no space remained to record the girl behind the titles. Her identity was reduced to a series of transactions, her name used as a bridge between estates. The absence of personal detail is not unusual for noble girls of her era. Many were married young, served dynastic goals, and died before adulthood. Their stories were not considered central to the grand chronicle of kings, battles, and succession. In Anne's case, the historical gaps are not the result of deliberate erasure, but of systemic omission. The frameworks of medieval record-keeping did not prioritize the interior lives of children, especially girls, whose roles were seen as symbolic rather than autonomous. After her death in 1481, Anne was buried in the Chapel of St. Erasmus at Westminster Abbey. That small honor marked her moment of visibility. But within decades, the chapel was demolished to make way for Henry VII's Lady Chapel. Anne's remains were moved, unrecorded, and eventually forgotten. Her name receded from public consciousness, preserved only in obscure legal history and occasional footnotes on Yorkist alliances. The 1964 rediscovery of her coffin near the chapter house of Westminster Abbey brought renewed, if brief, attention. Forensic analysis confirmed her identity. Her bones revealed no signs of trauma, just the short growth and incomplete development of a child who had died young. In 1965, she was reburied, this time with a plaque bearing her name. Still, the ceremony was quiet. No public procession, no royal presence. Just the final acknowledgement of someone once central to a political plan, now acknowledged by the institution that had once misplaced her. Anne's story has since become a point of study for historians examining the intersection of gender, childhood, and power in medieval England. She is now cited in discussions about child marriage, heiress control, and the use of female bodies in aristocratic politics. In that sense, her legacy has shifted. She is no longer just a footnote in a royal family tree. She is a case study, a reminder that political history is built on lives that were often silent, yet deeply affected. There are no surviving images of Anne, no sculpture, no stained glass, no confirmed likeness. What exists is her coffin, her skeletal analysis, and the documents that once arranged her marriage and distributed her inheritance. These fragments, while limited, offer a lens into how one child could be swept into dynastic ambition, valued for her name and holdings, then forgotten when her usefulness ended. In Westminster Abbey today, Anne lies in a modest grave near the chapter house. Tourists often pass without noticing. Her plaque is understated. There is no marble effigy or gilded canopy, just an inscription acknowledging her name, titles, and the year of her death. It stands in contrast to the elaborate tombs of kings and queens nearby. But it also underscores something more subtle. Remembrance need not be grand to be meaningful. Her name, once lost, has returned. Anne de Mowbray did not shape England's history through action or voice. She died before she could influence court or crown. Yet her life reflects how noble children were bound by alliances, used to secure power, and quietly erased when their role was fulfilled. She stands for countless girls whose futures were not chosen, but assigned. To remember Anne is to recognize those silent figures beneath dynastic ambition, names without agency, lives without record, still silent, but after centuries, no longer entirely forgotten.